Abby Wood and Sam Wolfe are proud to present a closer look into the life and poetry of Marianne Moore. I advise that those who are faint of heart should take caution in viewing this video, or should simply leave the room, as its content is not suited for you. Just kidding. Anyways, Marianne Moore was born near St. Louis, Missouri on November 15, 1887. She was raised in the home of her grandfather until he died in 1894, and then she and her family moved to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. There, she attended Bryn Mawr College and received her Bachelor of the Arts degree in 1909. She studied typing at Carlisle Commercial College after that, and then received a teaching job at the Carlisle Indian School from 1911 to 1915. Moore and her mother moved to New York City in 1918, and in 1921 she began to meet poets such as William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens while working at the New York Public Library. Moore contributed to The Dial, a prestigious literary magazine, and served as acting editor from 1925 to 1929. A great deal of Moore's poems are published in an English magazine entitled The Egoist, along with the works of other members of the Imagist movement, such as Ezra Pound and H.D. In 1921, and without Moore's knowledge, H.D. published Marianne's first book, simply called Poems. Moore was widely recognized for her work. She wrote with the freedom characteristic of the other modernist poets, often incorporating quotes from other sources in the text. Her usage of language was described by many as extraordinarily condensed and precise, capable of suggesting a variety of ideas and associations within a single, compact image. It is highly possible that her poetry was influenced by other Imagist poets of the time. She was praised by William Carlos Williams in an essay he wrote in 1925 entitled Marianne Moore. He wrote about her signature mode, the vastness of the particular. So that in looking at some apparently small object, he wrote, one feels the swirl of great events. Moore drew a lot of her inspiration from the things around her. That is to say, she took day-to-day encounters and turned them into art through poetry. In an interview with Paris Review, Moore declared, "Everything I have written is the result of reading or of interest in people. Anything that really rouses me." It is also a known fact that she was particularly fond of animals, and much of her imagery is drawn from the natural world. Aside from poetry, Moore's favorite pastime was attending baseball games. This picture was shot in 1968 when Marianne Moore threw out the first pitch of the year at Yankee Stadium. Her love for the all-American sport was translated into one of her most famous poems entitled Baseball in Writing, which we will be taking a look at now. Take a few moments to read over this excerpt from Moore's 4-page poem. Obviously, in this poem, Moore is comparing baseball and writing, pointing out that they are not at all that different in her mind. However, and on a deeper level, one could consider that Moore is also attempting to compare animals and athletes, as was expressed when she wrote, "They are subjects for art and exemplars of it, are they not? Minding their own business. Pangolins, hornbills, pitchers, catchers, do not pry or pray, or prolong the conversation, do not make us self-conscious, look their best when caring least. I don't know how to account for a person who could be indifferent to miracles of dexterity." However, back to the poem at hand. The first thing one notices at first glance would be that this poem is written in free verse. There is no set rhyme or meter. Another thing to note is the word owlman in the 10th line. No, Moore is not talking about the nocturnal creatures that take to the sky at night. She's using the owl as a metaphor, referring to how the New York sporting press looks as they watch the game through binoculars. Except for the first, each stanza of Moore's poem includes quoted dialogue and various forms of figurative language to bring the reader to the ballpark, attesting to her very unconventional style of writing. Through the use of similes, metaphors, and quoted dialogue, from both herself and various ballplayers, Moore enhances the imagery and realism of the poem. Moore experiments with various kinds of dialogue to enhance imagery and realism, but her method works. From the poem in total, the reader experiences the excitement and Moore's passion for both baseball and writing. Now we're going to move on to perhaps Moore's most popular poem entitled Poetry. You will have approximately 5 seconds to read this entire poem. Just kidding. While this is actually a version of Moore's poem Poetry, a more widely used version of the poem was later created. Moore ended up cutting the poem to only the first 3 lines. Easier, no? While analyzing this abbreviated version of poetry, one will notice that in the first line, Moore says that she dislikes it as well, the it referring to poetry itself. This is irony, because she is writing a poem about how she dislikes poetry, contradicting herself. Perhaps one of her most famous phrases, which can be found in the longer version of the poem, is imaginary garden with real toads in them, which Moore uses to distinguish the things about which poets write, the real toads, from the artificial, human-made context for those things, the imaginary gardens. It is safe to say that Moore considers herself a real toad amongst a structured, 5-stanza, 5-sentence, syllabic imaginary garden, seeing as she refers to her poems as prosaic things that were called poetry because there is no other category in which to put them. In short, poetry is a concrete poem in which Moore describes how when poetry is too abstract, it becomes self-destructive. This is because the reader has to analyze the poem so much they lose the experience of reading and enjoying it.
Moore was inspired by the natural world. She studied color theory, which some critics mention as influencing the fish. The poem uses imagery to paint an animated picture of wildlife using various colors and shapes to stimulate the reader's perception of the ocean. The poem is not about fish at all, but rather the relationship among a seaside cliff, sea life, and the sea itself. Sunlight acts upon the sea and its creatures, and the sea acts upon a cliff. One of the more noticeable features of the poem is its form. It is written in syllabic verse, and lines whose last words rhyme are grouped together through indentations. The first 2 rhyming lines of the stanza are followed by the next 2 rhyming lines, which are indented to the right, and the last line that stands alone, which is indented even further. This constant, almost pulling and pushing movement symbolizes the movement of waves in the ocean. Interestingly, the word indentation also means grooves and recesses in the coastline, a description that appears near the end of the poem when it talks about the damaged cliff in the sea. Whether or not this was Moore's intention is debatable. There are other works of hers which include similar indentations. The title itself should be read together with the first line of the first stanza to form the line, "The fish wade through the black jade." This continuation invokes the thought of connectedness. Just how all oceans are connected to form one big body of water, the first line is connected to the title to form a stanza. This togetherness resonates throughout the entire poem as seen when the last line of a preceding stanza continues on to the first line of the next stanza. All the stanzas of the poem interact, as one cannot be read without the other. The poem goes over different animals and the activities that they do to show their interactions with one another and the environment. An example is the mussels adjusting ash heaps, showing how the mussel's actions directly change its immediate surroundings. The ash heaps, which is a metaphor for sand, makes the mussel a part of something bigger. That is, its actions affect the ocean itself, where other creatures live as well. The processes of life and death are everywhere in this poem. The poem then zooms out to show the bigger picture when it mentions the defiant edifice in which these animals lived. The poem uses words such as abuse, burns, and hatchet strokes, among others, to depict the damaged state of this edifice, noting that beyond the cliff there is only the dead side. In this case, the poem equates living alone to death. Thus, living beings prefer to stick together despite the collective damage that they cause to their habitat. and indirectly to each other, instead of living in isolation. This brings back the concept of togetherness. The lines of the poem, which must be read together, represent how the animals depicted in the poem must live together in order to survive.
The prizes Moore received in her lifetime included the Bullingdon Prize, the National Book Award, and the Pulitzer Prize. Other awards she received were the Ernest Hartsock Memorial Prize in 1935, the Shelley Memorial Award in 1941, the Harriet Monroe Poetry Award in 1944, and the Contemporary Poetry Patrons Prize in 1945. In 1981, the complete poems of Marianne Moore, the definitive edition with the author's final revisions, was made. In 1986, the complete prose of Marianne Moore, From Illusion is More Precise Than Precision, the poetry of Marianne Moore, was published. Marianne Moore died at the ripe old age of 85 in New York City in 1972. Thanks for watching. You can call it love on the day. You can go your own way.